All right. So we're talking about tort, which is a legal term associated with liability and civil law and has significant implications when it comes to education. According to the Dry article, tort law concerns civil wrongs and addresses the duty, breach, and injury sustained to one individual as a result of another's conduct, usually ending up only in a civil court of some kind, although it could ultimately have criminal implications, as is the case in some of the cases that were reviewed where people try to bring assault and battery criminal cases against teachers. First case I looked at was Frame versus Comeau. Dr. Comeau was a teacher that was administering a spelling test. There were several disruptive students. He asked those students to leave. One of the students refused to leave. It was Frame who, when asked multiple times to leave, refused. As Dr. Comeau approached the student to communicate with them further and escort them out of the room, the student got up. I'm going to guess that was perceived as a fairly aggressive move. Dr. Comeau took him by the arm, at which case Frame actually fell against the wall, hurting himself slightly. He sued, claiming assault and battery. The court ultimately ruled in Dr. Comeau's favor, saying that he did not have excessive force used, and that it was within his necessity in that case to be able to grab the student by the arm. My school would be very reactive to that because we already have requirements in place that only certified teachers who've gone through a training are allowed to touch a student no matter what. So there could be consequences for that teacher if that was in my school. Even though they were found not guilty, it's very possible the teacher could have been let go. In that instance, what needs to happen is the teacher needs to get a hold of someone who has that specialized restraining training and never actually touch the student. We have expectations in place that that's never allowed. We are proactive about that. We know that there are tort cases like this all the time. And so as a school district, we've put in expectations that teachers are only allowed to touch a student if they have gotten the appropriate training and that they need to get a hold of a teacher if there isn't. Now, I agree with my school policy, especially if there's no immediate harm, and this is the case, and there's no reason to ever have a teacher put their hands on a student. There are instances where, even in a fighting situation, where I know teachers react very quickly, thinking that there is immediate harm. But even in those instances, a lot of times a teacher can be held liable if the student is harmed while being broken up in a bullying situation. So it really is the policy of my district to not engage students in a physical way no matter what, unless you're given the specialized training. Second case I looked at was Flanagan versus Canton. Flanagan was a student who was severely harmed when pushed against a locker after a PE class, not by the teacher, by another student. The teacher was not present at the time the students were changing because he was already talking with another student about their behavior. There had been a lot of problems with behavior during class that day. The parents sued the school for negligent supervision since the PE teacher was not in the locker room when the students were changing. And ultimately, the parents won, especially because since there had been so many significant disruptions during class, the courts ruled that the teacher should have felt an added sense of needing to supervise the locker room after the PE class. It is possible the school would ultimately dismiss this teacher. I know in my first year of teaching, there was a chemistry teacher who was dismissed by my school. She had left her classroom, albeit with only a handful of students. It was the last couple days of school. There were only 3 or 4 students left in her class because her seniors had graduated. But she left the room to go to the bathroom, and the students decided to try and do their own experiments, which resulted in an explosion and a minor burn to a student, and the teacher was let go immediately. Proactively, there should be a general policy that teachers are within reasonable distance of supervising students at all time. For example, we are expected to be in the hallway during passing periods, but we're always still close enough to our rooms to give immediate supervision if a situation were to arise. Third case, Mitchell versus Cedar Rapids Community School District. Mitchell was a special education student under the age of 15 who had had a sexual relationship with another student who was over 18 while skipping the last hour of the school day. Mitchell's parents sued the school for not doing a better job tracking the attendance of her child, who had fairly significant special needs. Mitchell was ultimately awarded $500,000 in damages, the majority of which was paid by the school district. Reactively, my school would probably put in place provisions to better supervise our special education students. Even as they travel from class to class, this was a situation where the student was skipping school, and the parents argued that she, with her needs, should have been escorted from class to class, possibly by a parent or someone. And then if the situation arose where they were counted absent or the student was found missing with an unexcused absence, there should be a greater effort to find the location of that student immediately rather than letting the attendance policy kind of work its own system. A better attendance monitoring system that would more immediately inform parents if a student has an unexcused absence would help the school from being maybe liable in this case if it's sent out immediately that the student was missing. The parent could have been more proactive in trying to find out where the student was. The fourth case I looked at was Johnson versus the school district of Millard. Johnson was a first grader who was playing a game in a music class that the teacher had just taught them how to play. He was accidentally flung into a bookshelf and actually sustained a fairly significant injury, including 50 stitches above his eye. The school district was sued for negligence because the teacher was not directly supervising the student while the game was being played, and the teacher had only taught him the rules once. The plaintiffs won over $20,000 in damages, and the school district appealed to the Supreme Court of Nebraska, but ultimately the lower court ruling was affirmed, and the district had to pay a variety of damages. First implication that would be reactive is, again, for the lack of supervision, that teacher could very well lead to their dismissal, and especially in this case when the school district was found at fault. Proactively, so many court cases seem to be involved in situations where the teacher or whoever the staff member is not actively supervising at all times. We need to make sure that teachers are reasonably doing what is expected of them at all time and foremost supervising students to keep them safe, because the tort law is pretty clear that if a teacher is doing everything they can reasonably to keep the students safe, the school has very little liability in those instances. Last case was Peterson versus Baker, very similar to the first case. Peterson and her friend Jonathan were students in a class in which they were being disruptive. Johnson was asked to leave. Peterson was not. When Peterson tried to leave because she wanted to leave, the teacher, who was Baker, blocked the door with her arm. The student then placed her hands on the teacher's arm, flinging her out of the way. The teacher claimed it was a fairly violent move. The student claimed she just barely moved her hand. Either way, the teacher then grabbed Peterson by the neck. Peterson sued for battery, but the court ruled in the teacher's favor, both because the act was not done in malice and was not excessive. Again, I mean, this is a situation where we as teachers, unless given very explicit training, are not allowed to restrain students for absolutely any reason whatsoever. What the teacher should have done, as expected in our system, is let the student leave, but immediately call a principal or the resource officer or someone who is trained to come and find that student to make sure that they stay safe. And so we would want to be proactive. I know in my second year at my school district, we were given minor training in this instance and told a lot of the legal liabilities when it comes to touching students. We haven't had any of those trainings in the last couple of years, so that would be something useful to do proactively, is remind the staff of what is expected of them when it comes to putting hands on students or restraining students. I was reading an article in my research by Dr. Essex where they outlined several guidelines that I would suggest be adopted as my professional ethics to prevent tort problems. First is creating a safe classroom. Do all that is possible to keep students safe while under your supervision. If you are reasonably doing everything that can be expected of you, the tort liability is very limited. Be proactive. Look to the future to see possible areas that could be concerning and prevent the problem before it occurs. For example, I teach chemistry. We have a safety lesson that we go over for a couple days at the beginning of the year. The students take a safety test. They have to sign a safety contract. The parents have to sign a safety contract, really making it so my liability, should an accident occur during a chemical experiment of some kind, my liability is lower because I did everything I could to make sure that the students were taught what is necessary to be safe. And then also, while doing experiments, I give very, very strict expectations and very intense supervision. Avoid all negligent behavior, like a teacher just randomly leaving kids in a classroom. That's an unnecessary negligent behavior. Yes, most of the time nothing would happen. In the case of the chemistry teacher, my first year, she trusted her juniors who were in an advanced chemistry course. There were only a handful. She thought they were mature. They were the type of students that you would leave your kids home alone with as babysitters. But she put herself in an unnecessary negligent behavior by leaving the room for a significant period of time. And then lastly, just use your good judgment. All the articles, when they were talking about how you can limit your liability, is anytime you are able to prove that you showed your best judgment when dealing with the situation.